So I sat here for quite a while thinking about what would be a good, clever saying to open this video with. But the reality is, when it comes to my robot, I ignored a lot of problems for a long time. This right here is Nylon Brigade, my AntWeight 1-pound combat robot. I guess I gotta specify that because in other parts of the world, well, AntWeight is a different weight class. It's kind of like the whole soccer versus football thing, I guess, and you know what they say about that. There's only two types of countries in the world. One calls soccer football, and the other has walked on the moon. Seriously though, I'm gonna take some flack for that comment, I bet. But when it comes to the competitions, oftentimes these videos people make are about competitions that go fantastically well. This is definitely not one of them. This is about a competition where things went fairly wrong fairly fast. So first up was against a robot named Slam. This is my first fight from the Midwest Robot Rumble in Granville, Michigan. And Slam is a highly optimized two-wheel drum robot. From what the builder was telling me, the entire drum assembly clocks in at around 120 grams, which, if you do the math, that's a little bit over 25% of the robot's weight. I was a little bit worried that it was going to be throwing me around a lot and kind of launching me. Fortunately, that didn't happen, but the fight was basically this. I would go in for the attack, or he would go in for the attack, and I would end up driving over him. Again, and again, and again. And then this moment happened. And that produced that right there. It doesn't seem too bad until I add the important fact that that damage there is about 1 millimeter away from starting a battery fire. All right, back to the fight for just a little bit more. So here's the thing that I've been ignoring for Nylon Brigade pretty much since the beginning of the robot, because one of these two things, if not both of them, have happened in every fight, and that's that I lose a tire gets ripped off, or the drive belt fouls off, or something gets jacked up with one or both sides of the drive system, and that happened here against Slam. And by the time the 2 minutes is over, I can barely move because things are just totally gunked up. And well, the tires pop off so easily because they pop on really easily. They're just sitting in here in a little 3D printed slot, and I can just pop them on and pop them off, and that's just how the robot was designed. I really have to say that I completely ignored that for the entire lifespan of the robot. I've had the same basic wheel design. These are a little bit smaller, but it's the same basic design I've had since version 1 of Nylon Brigade, and that's happened all the time. Now, it doesn't happen in testing. They stay on fine all the time in testing, but once they get hit a little bit, well, then they come off. And I never bothered to redesign the wheels to solve that problem. Lots of people have done so with their robots, so the fact that I didn't means I've completely ignored this issue with the robot since the very beginning. And this time around, between both these fights, I think, it got a little bit worse. Because before, usually what happened is the little silicone rubber tires would get slashed in half and they'd fall off. But this time, they get popped off the wheel, and then they get gunked in the drive system like this. And you'll notice now, one side of the drive system doesn't work because the tire over there is gunking the entire thing up. Very frustrating. Very, very frustrating. Now also, the drive belts here that connect the two wheels together have a tendency to pop off, and that's been around since day one. See my videos and trying to get these front either wheels straight. They're a lot better, and that solved the problem a lot, but they still can get knocked off in combat. However, back in the day, it wasn't that big of an issue, but it is much more of an issue now, and that's why I really have to fix it. Compared to version 1 of the robot, the weapon motor is heavier, and the weapon assembly is also heavier, which, of course, that shifts a bunch of the weight forward, and then therefore the center of the mass is further away from the two actual drive motors, which are back here. Therefore, when I lose my four-wheel drive, I have a lot less traction in this version of the robot than I did in version 1, and my mobility suffers quite a bit. Now, I'm obviously not going to go to a smaller weapon system. In fact, I'm going to go with a larger one at some point. So to address that problem, I could either spread the wheels out a little bit to get a little bit more tension, or I could probably take my belt and drop it down by 1 tooth. This is just a custom design, custom 3D printed TPU belt, so I can do things like that, assuming that I remember how to actually create the belt. I think I do. And I don't think it ended up in a video. I may have in the past with some of my videos, when I forgot I did something, I went back and watched the video to remind myself. And I don't think that happened in one of these videos, but maybe it did. Anyway, yeah, so at the end of the day, that was a loss via judge's decision. I think it was 12-5. There's some sort of 17-point scale. I have no idea how judging worked at the competition, so the point is I lost. Well, that brings me up to my next fight, which is against Lawnmower of Chaos. If you've watched some of my videos before, that name may sound familiar. I fought her in the first time I took Nylon Brigade to an event, which was Michigan Mashup 2023, and I won that fight due to knockout. And also, well, just a random fun fact, apparently she's the sister of the guy who drives Slam, so it's a bit of a family affair, I guess, for me in my fights for this competition. Anyway, random fact. Let's get to this fight. My strategy when I fought Lawnmower of Chaos back a year or so ago was to charge in the weapon system and then strike whenever I had a chance to do so. I did the same thing this time. Results were a little bit different. First of all, from what the builder was telling me, that their robot was much more reliable. So I won the first time around because the weapon motor stopped. I flipped over the robot, and that was that. So I guess I'd have to do a little bit more work to possibly disable the weapon this time, but like I said, my strategy was still the same. Some things changed about Nylon Brigade for the good, and some things for the not so good. The first problem in the not so good category is going to be the armor. I mentioned about this a bit ago, and yeah, the armor doesn't hold up nearly well as it does in this version versus the first version, and there's an obvious reason for that. Originally, Nylon Brigade used this armor band right here, which is UHMW. Currently, Nylon Brigade uses a 3D printed nylon armor band, and simply put it, UHMW takes hits a lot better than 3D printed nylon, especially when it is as thin as a tiny UHMW armor band. We'll dive a little bit more into that after the fight, but let's jump back into the action. The robot's got stuck a few times, mainly because her blade dove into my armor, and I was kind of controlling the fight here, driving around, but hey, that doesn't really matter a whole lot because eventually, guess what? The drive system craps out again. Now, the drive system is fine. It's the tires and the drive belts crap out again. So let me be a little bit more specific there. And just like the first time around, by the time we get to the end of the fight here, my robot is pretty much immobile. But because there's only a few seconds left in the fight, I'm not counted out, and it goes to judge's decision. So I think the result was, of course, a loss for Nylon Brigade, so now I'm out of the tournament. But I believe the score was also 12-5 in favor of Lawnmower of Chaos. So yeah, that was not a particularly great event for me. And let me talk a little bit more about what the problems are specifically with the armor. I gave a little bit about damage resilience, and that's really mainly what it is. Of course, 3D printed things, in the case of the armor band, are printed from, in this case, from the bottom to the top. So I have a bunch of layer lines running parallel to the ground here. And it's simply when this thing takes a hit there, those layer lines split apart because that's what 3D printed pieces do. Whereas UHMW doesn't really do that. It gets nicked, it gets scratched, a bit of chunk is taken out of it, but all in all, it holds its integrity pretty darn well. Which, just on a random note, I upgraded these to UHMW from polycarbonate for the weapon sports, and they work great. In fact, they got a lot of nicks and scratches taken out of them from both Slam, this is the robot that fought Slam, and also from Lawnmower of Chaos, which that robot you'll see in a moment when I do some weigh-ins. And They got nicks and scratches in them, little pieces missing, but no integrity failure whatsoever. Now, the reason why I switched to 3D printed armor was because I wanted to be able to swap it out easier, and I certainly can. On the top of the robot here, there's 4 little screws, 2 here, and there's little hex standoffs made of brass that run through the robot, and the armor just slides down onto those and comes out. And that was also another weakness in the design of the robot that I have to fix. There are little tabs here, just 3D printed tabs that connect the outer band of the armor to these pegs, and oddly enough, the exact same one snapped in both fights. One more thing I want to point out as I slowly rotate the weapon motor, you can see there's a lot of nicks out of the body of the weapon motor. This damage in this case was done by Slam, but in my last event, Jeff did something similar as well. And this is simply because the motor itself sits a little bit below the bottom of the chassis, and it's fairly vulnerable to enemy weapons. So that is something I want to think about when it comes to protecting it a little bit better. I thought I would finish up the video by talking just a little bit about the ground game. I did mention it earlier in the video. And when it comes to that particular feature, I would like to integrate something into this robot to make that better, but it's not a top priority. When it comes to the 1-pound weight class, there isn't a lot of extra weight for things like ground game, unless of course you're Slam and you're highly optimized and designed for it from the get-go. So I might still do it, but that's going to be kind of a lower priority thing. Everything else with, the drive train sucking and falling apart is a bit more important, as well as getting the armor better. And when I go ahead and fix those things, I have to fix them twice, because like most people, I have multiple copies of my AntWeight combat robot. This one over here is the one that fought Lawnmower of Chaos, in case you were curious. And the UHMW armor weapon supports, or weapon supports up here, they held up pretty well, even against a horizontal spinner. Just one last random note. And when it comes to designing new features for this robot, with the battery, he comes in at 438 grams, so I have a little bit of weight to work with, but I've got other options to save weight for newer assorted features. And if you want to see what solutions I come up to for those various problems, go ahead and do that YouTube thing, hit subscribe, like, all that fun stuff, because I'm going to be starting a new series of videos where I keep fixing those problems. And I will actually fix them this time. So thank you guys all for watching. I'm Jason, the creator of Team Rocket Robotics, as well as Nylon Brigade, my AntWeight combat robot. And I will see you next time when I get around to fixing this robot. Just in a random production note, he's my stand-in for focusing, if you ever want to know what his job was in the set.